Watershed Management 101. It's not for those who have earlier taken courses in watershed. It's for what I would say for the uninitiated. And so bear with me for those who are experts on the subject already. My presentation will be uh, uh, shown in this slide. So I'll talk about what watershed is, its features, the hydrologic cycle, what that makes the watershed world go around, and talk a little bit on watershed management, particularly on how forests play a role and how it is made when things are applied in the ground. Now, let's start immediately with watershed, for I have only 20 minutes. So based on various definitions, it's just a body of land draining to a certain outlet. Or more formally, it's a continuum of interrelated ecosystems from headwaters in the forest lands to the downstream areas or until when the river goes out to the base. It's synonymous to catchments, drainage area, river basin. This can be illustrated this way based on the earlier definition. So from the top ridge going to the outlet in the base. So it includes all resources therein. That includes your forests, your residential areas. It means that includes your barangays, your towns, and even cities if there are cities within this drainage area. So the watershed itself is the whole drainage area. It can be defined or delineated by tracing out the ridges that surrounds that area where when water falls during rain, they all go to a particular outlet. All of these areas is called the watershed. Now, that's what we call a topographic divide of the watershed. Now, sometimes when rain drops in that particular watershed, when water infiltrates to the ground, there may be underlying rock strata beneath the aquifers, for example, and your water that infiltrated may not go through this outlet, but may go somewhere else. And that's defined by the boundary of the watershed underground called geologic divide. I will add a third divide. Due to the intervention of man, sometimes water from one particular watershed may be diverted to another watershed. A specific point, example, is the diversion of the Casecnan River at the upstream of the Cagayan River watershed, for example, that was diverted to the Pantabangan Dam at the Pampanga River Basin on the other side of the Caraballo Mountains. The diversion was made through a 27-kilometer tunnel that augments the water supply in the Pantabangan Dam. So it even was made to go beyond Pampanga River Basin because the irrigation system reaches the province of Pangasinan, so it even cuts across to the Agno River Basin. So I call that man-made or anthropogenic divide. For those who are familiar with the maps, if you have topographic maps such as this NAMRIA map, then we can trace your watershed boundaries by just following the ridges, and the sub-catchments or sub-watersheds may be defined by tracing these ridges, and you can see where they are going, and from there you can define your watershed or catchment. Now let's go into the features of the watershed. So based on that description of the divide, then there are biophysical features such as it has its climate, there are geomorphological characteristics, it has topography, soil properties, there are spatial elements that are very important. For example, land use, land cover, your residential areas, and of course, biodiversity, plants and animals that are within the drainage area or watershed. And very important are its social features that includes political boundaries. We know that watershed transcend political boundaries. And so that complicates when things in the watershed are managed because there are political conflicts that may arise. Built up areas, for example, your subdivisions, conversions of agricultural areas to residential areas. These are features of the watershed that are very important when we try to manage the watershed. And of course, the people that stay in that area, their culture, their capabilities, and distribution. Let's now go into the water cycle that drives the watershed. It is generally coming from up from the atmosphere, falls as rainfall. Of course, snow in some other parts, but let's limit ourselves to the Philippines. It may drop at rainfall. It may evaporate and transpire from plants. When it reaches water bodies, this may evaporate partly. There are those which run above the ground in the form of runoff, and there are those parts of the water that goes into the groundwater. Let's take each of these one by one. Let's start with rainfall. Rainfall has characteristics. It has its intensity. It may be a downpour. It may just be a drizzle, or usually expressed in the amount per unit time. Now it has a duration. Sometimes it may last for a minute or so, or it may be for the whole day. It has a total amount per rainfall event, and it has a distribution based on the watershed. So it may only be at the upstream, it may be on the downstream, or on what particular parts of or subcatchment. The next is evapotranspiration. Of course, that's a combination of your evaporation from water bodies, even from plants. But and that of transpiration due to photosynthesis coming from plants. Approximately, atmospheric moisture is comprised of 90% from evaporation and 10% from transpiration. These are affected, evapotranspiration is affected by weather, whether it's very hot or cold, and the soil conditions, of course. When your soil is porous, or then infiltration may happen, and so lesser water for evaporation. Now, for the foresters, they usually emphasize the role of forests in the water cycle. As much as 24% may be intercepted by canopy for a 1 centimeter rainfall. But of course, when the rainfall is very strong, that will be greatly lessened. Depending upon the kind of vegetation, the amount intercepted by the vegetation may vary also. And obviously coniferous plants, because of the nature of their leaves and barks, intercept more compared to broadleaves and other species. The next, infiltration is the next, and it is the entry of water into the soil surface. If your soil is porous, then infiltration will be higher. It is affected by rainfall, vegetation. If there's vegetation and the rain is not that much, then no water may reach the soil, so no infiltration will happen. All will be intercepted. Topography also affects infiltration. The more level your soil is, the greater chances for infiltration. If it's very slopey, it will all be surface runoff. the soil characteristics, especially the antecedent soil moisture content. If your soil is saturated, then there's no way for infiltration to occur already. Everything will go flow out, and so in the form of surface runoff. Now, it's very important. Infiltration is very important because it recharges the groundwater. It makes water available for plant, because unless it is absorbed by the soil, it will not be made available for plants. It influences surface runoff, of course. The lesser the infiltration, the more will flow in the form of surface runoff. And the next is, let's go in more detail for surface runoff. This is the water that travels over the soil surface towards the nearest stream channel. Now, the functions of surface runoff, it's of course the major cause of soil erosion. Usually when water flows above the ground, it brings soil with it, and may be problematic when it reach the waterways, and may cause siltation among stream channels. And this, of course, contributes to the stream flow. Now, biophysical factors affect surface runoff, and this includes your land use, whether you have cultivated areas. If you have vast cultivated areas, then the more likely that surface runoff will occur. Your vegetation cover is, of course, very critical. More cover, lesser surface runoff. Generally, the soil type, more porous ones will mean more infiltration, so lesser surface runoff. Your drainage area, your area watershed, the wider, of course, the more chance for surface runoff. Topography, drainage network pattern, the branching of your rivers, creeks, and the availability of water harvesting structures. You may have dams, ponds, reservoirs, or lakes, which will delay surface runoff going into the outlet. Now let's go to the streams. When your surface runoff reaches bodies of water, well-defined channels, either creeks, rivers, or drainage canals, for example, purposely made for the purpose, then your surface runoff becomes stream flow. And it's very important to understand this, because your watershed management will depend much on a good understanding of stream flow, because this is the major cause of flooding, erosion, and other problems related to excessive rain. Now, it has various components. First is the rain that goes direct to the stream channel. So it immediately joins the stream flow, the rain that drops to the channel. It may either be a surface runoff, those that the rain that is not infiltrated and therefore flows above ground and goes to the stream, or the subsurface flow, that part of the rainfall that infiltrates first and then joins the stream from the soil, or the groundwater flow, those that the part of the rain that goes to the groundwater and comes out as base flow. Base flow, by the way, is the water that makes your rivers, your streams perennially flow even during summer. This is the clear water that comes from springs. Now, these components can be illustrated this way: from the direct channel to the overland flow, from the groundwater to the interflow. Factors affect stream flow. Your basin shape, for example, aside from your rainfall, the shape of your watershed, just like, for example, just illustrated here, they define the kind of water that flows. We call this hydrograph in watershed. The rise and fall of your flow at the particular outlet will be affected by your shape of your watershed. So you can see the longer, the more delay it will have, and the corresponding hydrograph will be more even. Channel characteristics, of course, whether it's deep, shallow, whether it's meandering, straight, all of those characters define the kind of your stream flow. Land use, of course, the more cultivated areas, the more likely that your surface runoff will be higher, and so your stream flow will correspondingly be higher. To understand your stream flow, there's a need for us to measure it. And it's measured by a formula, Q is equal to A times V, where A is the cross-sectional area of the stream channel, and V is the velocity of the water in that particular point. So it is how fast your water flows. We can illustrate it this way. That means that your stream flow is defined by how deep your water is and how wide is the channel. The wider the channel and the deeper, the more water can flow. That means that if your surface runoff happens and brings soil sediments and deposits it in your stream bed, causing it to be more shallow, lessening the capacity to accommodate water to flow. That means that your water in this channel may rise and may overflow the normal stream bank. That means that flooding will occur. So those interrelationships from surface runoff, the vegetation affecting surface runoff, to the sedimentation that happens on the stream channel, these are all interrelated when it comes to flooding that occur during rains. Now, velocity is likewise dependent upon the depth and the width of your channel. Usually, this is measured by your current meter. You measure it from different parts of the width and then different depths so that you can take the average velocity of water flowing in your stream bed, in your stream channel. You multiply that by the cross section, that's the amount of water that flows per unit time. Now, knowing those interrelationships among various factors, from biophysical characters of the watershed to the climatic factors that affect your weather, the amount of water that drops, the amount of water that reaches the channel, there's a need to understand all of these things so that we will know what interventions can be made so that we can manage our watershed. Broadly, we can say that water management is the control of the watershed and its resources to carry out planned activities to attain objectives. General objective of watershed management is to transform and manage the watershed into productive, ecologically stable, and sustainable resource for the benefit of the people. More specifically, the first is to control and regulate water yield. That means that there is a need for to manage your water such that you can reduce peak flows during rainy seasons so that you can avoid flooding and make water available when it is scarce. For example, during droughts or during summer, if you do water harvesting, damming, etc., or you control soil erosion. It is said that if you can reduce your soil erosion to 10 tons per hectare per year, then that's good enough. And of course, you rehabilitate your watershed areas. This is the well-promoted approach to control flooding. This is, the government is implementing the NGP for reforestation. Now, these are just some of the specific objectives. There may be more specific objectives depending upon the kind of watershed you have. For example, if you have in an urban area, then it may be, you may have a different specific objective. Now, there are many problems in watershed management. Some of them include degraded soil, unabated deforestation, kaingin making and burning, overgrazing, human settlements, your mushrooming subdivisions, for example, the conversion of your agricultural lands into industrial areas. Jurisdiction over land is also a problem. As I mentioned earlier, there's watersheds transcend political boundaries. Sometimes, especially now, there are conflicts in tenurial instruments. There are multiple tenurial instruments that cover some areas, especially in the uplands. All of these are problems when you go into managing your watersheds. Human settlements, I would like to put emphasis on this, for they affect hydrology and water quality. Pollution, of course, is always there when there's human habitation, especially in the cities where earlier they did not prepare any sanitation mechanisms. Settlements also affect the vegetation along stream banks, such that at present there are no vegetation already within the supposedly riparian areas where vegetation is required, and the channel of your waterways is all affected by humans. So there is a need to prepare watershed management plans if we want to properly manage our watersheds. There are efforts in the past that were prepared, that plans were prepared to manage watersheds. In 1987, for example, particularly in Region 2, in 1987, after the EDSA revolution, a JICA-funded project was made to prepare an integrated management plan for the Cagayan River Basin. But until now, until 2010, this was not implemented. In that, it ended up as planned. There was a plan to dig a tunnel in the Magapit Bridge area, just because that's the chute of the Cagayan River. That's one of the major causes of flooding in the region. But nothing happened about that. Now, there's another plan. This is now Region 2, Cagayan Valley. An integrated Cagayan River Basin management plan was prepared and commissioned by the government, and a thoroughly prepared plan was made by a consulting group. It mapped out the different watersheds, sub-watersheds within the Cagayan River Basin. The flooding that happened in December last year, that caused many residents stranded in the roofs of their houses for 3 nights happened in this watershed. And you can see that based on this distribution, there are lots of watershed in the sub-watersheds in the Cagayan River Basin that all uh, meet at this particular point, and there's no other outlet except at this narrow point at the Magapit Bridge in Lalo, Cagayan. You can imagine the big river, Magat River, draining almost the whole province of Vizcaya and a part of Ifugao, draining into the Cagayan River, plus the Ilagan River that comes from as far as Aurora, meeting in Ilagan, and then the Chico River draining from Mountain Province, Kalinga, meeting the mighty Cagayan River, all converging at this area. You can imagine the kind of flood that may occur because of this narrow passage in the area of Lalo in the Makapit Bridge. It's a mountain on both sides of the river. And during that period, the 24-hour rainfall that dropped in that fateful December 12, it's more than the average monthly rainfall of August for the region, average total monthly rainfall for August. And there were typhoons and rains a week before that. That means that your antecedent moisture content, your soil is all saturated. So the rainfall were immediately surface runoff. So that's the cause of the flood that happened. The solution being made now is dredging. That's immediate. But the moment the rains again, when rains come again, then the dredging that may be done for a year may just be gone for just one rainy season, one rain event, flood event. Now, we can imagine, we can see that the flows may be schematically presented this way. So you can see the corresponding contribution of each watershed by these flows. So from the Magat and the Chico being the major sources of uh, stream flow to the outlet in Apari. Now, this is just in a normal stream flow. When there is typhoon, when there's excessive rain, you can imagine this as being bloated. This is schematic flows. Now, I would just like to present one more. I have lifted these maps from the comprehensive development plan prepared in 2012. That was completed in 2012, accepted by the Regional Development Council, but sadly, up to now, it's not implemented. Although there's a special body created in the region to take care of all of these things related to this problem. I would just like to highlight that the land use aspect, the vegetation cover plays a very important role when it comes to looking at managing the forest, managing the watershed as a whole. We can see that although this may be forests, these are open already. And when we go into the cultivated areas, you will see that 50% of the whole watershed is cultivated. So you can imagine if rainfall drops evenly throughout, then just a very little portion is covered by forest. Notice that Cagayan Valley is known to be the number one corn producer in the country. And so if you go to Quirino, for example, in Nagtipunan particularly, the once forested areas there are all, when it's corn production time, you can see all of these mountain ranges covered with corn areas from Nagtipunan, San Agustin, Jones, going to San Mariano, Ilagan, and all of the foothills of the Sierra Madre. These are all, as far as the eyes can see, these are all covered with corn. That makes, of course, the Cagayan Valley as the #1 corn producer. I hope that with this, I have presented considerations on thinking more rationally when we talk about reasons on flooding. So, as a parting quotation, I would say that there's an absence on political will on implement of existing plans. As I mentioned, there was a plan in '87, another plan in 2012, but of course, to this day, there's a need to implement these plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Dante, for providing us the science of watershed and watershed management, linking the watershed, forest, or the vegetation cover, and the water services. And as mentioned previously, there's really need for effective watershed management. So this is the objective of the project being implemented by the Balasig Watershed, by the Cagayan Valley Program on Environment and Development. So our next speaker is a instructor at the College of Forestry Environmental Management in Isabela State University in Cabagan. He received both his Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Master of Science in Forestry at the same college, the same university. He is the assistant project leader of the Balasig Watershed Management Project implemented by the Cagayan Valley Program for Environment and Development. So let us gladly welcome Forester Rocel Galicia. Forester Rocel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Okay, good afternoon to each and everyone. This time, I will present to you the Balasig Watershed project of the Isabela State University and Cagayan Valley Program on Environment and Development on behalf of our project leader, Dr. Cecilia Mangabat. So the 3-year project is in partnership with the Forest Foundation Philippines, together with our partners from the local government units of Cabagan, Tumawini, and San Pablo. And of course, partners also from the national government agencies such as the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture, National Irrigation Administration, and the Department of Trade and Industry. The watershed is bounded to the north by the Pinakanawan San Pablo, on the north, the Sierra Madre Natural Park, and then to the west is the Cagayan River, and then to the south is the Tunmawini Watershed Natural Park. The Balasig Watershed has a total area of 26,366 hectares, composed of 31 barangays within the municipalities of Cabagan with 10 barangays, Tumawini 21 barangays, and this portion of 1 barangay from San Pablo. The 63% of the watershed is classified as forest land, which are potential for reforestation and other rehabilitation projects. The watershed also supports about 37% agricultural lands planted with different crops such as rice, corn, banana, and other crops. Okay, next. This is the flow of the activities being conducted in the duration of the project. First is the stakeholders consultation meeting to, of course, to identify the challenges and opportunities in the area based on the first perception or knowledge of the stakeholders. Then the technical working group was formed for the conduct of assessment in the watershed. The assessment was conducted to assess the status of biophysical, the socio-economic, and the environmental components of the watershed. Because, of course, based on our data, we still have a very limited data and information of the watershed, which will serve as baseline information in the planning. And then based on the fieldworks, challenges and opportunities were also observed and identified. And then in this part of one of the activities, which is the identification and conduct of research for those challenges, were temporarily freeze due to the restrictions brought by the pandemic. Then the major output of the assessment is the ecological profile of the watershed, which was presented to the stakeholders from the barangay level up to the municipal and national agencies for their validation. The profile was validated and then used as the basis in the formulation of the harmonized plan of the watershed. Then next, of course, the draft plan was presented to the stakeholders for their comments and inputs before the plan was finalized. Then next, the plan was presented to the LGU for their adoption and implementation. And then the 2 remaining years of the project is the implementation and, of course, the evaluation of the strategies implemented based on the plan. So that is how the project operates. Then next. Okay, this is the assessment teams from the Isabela State University who assess the different components of the watershed, particularly the biophysical, socioeconomic, environment, and governance aspects of the watershed. We have here the teams from the biodiversity, social, water, and governance. Next. For the fauna, this is the highlight of the assessment. As we can see, there were 62 species of fauna composed of 49 avifauna, then 6 species of bats, 5 species of amphibians, and 2 reptiles. We also found out the threatened species of fauna based on the IUCN Red List. There are 3 species of birds which are near threatened, 1 species of amphibian which is near threatened, and 3 bird species which are vulnerable. Next. For the flora assessment, we found out that there was 80 species and 52 genera and 30 families of flora with an endemism of 38%. And there were also threatened species found in the area which are categorized as vulnerable and critically endangered. These photographs showing some of the threatened species found in the Balasig Watershed. Next. Based on the water quality and water quantity assessment, we observed the presence of equal counts from all the sampling points in the different streams and even in spring all over the watershed, which may pose some health issues for people if they use it for drinking. So it is no longer safe. Okay. So next. Based on the secondary data, we have here the tenurial instruments. We can see that the watershed has still 39% untenured, which are potential for reforestation projects. Then, of course, we identified only 2 tenurial instruments in the area. We have the forest land grazing management areas and the community-based forest management areas. However, during the fieldworks, we also observed the presence of undocumented grazing areas all over the forest lands of the watershed. Based on the several discussions, meetings, and fieldworks conducted, we identified the issues and challenges in the area. So first, this slide shows the natural hazards in the watershed. And I just want to emphasize that the watershed is highly susceptible, particularly to flooding, landslide, and erosion, which we want to address in this project. At least maybe we can lessen the impacts, if not to totally stop it. Next. The 2019 land cover shows that, just look on the map, the built-up areas, the color red symbol in this map indicates the presence of occupants and migrants in the upland areas, particularly even in this secondary forest, as well as the presence of croplands in the secondary forest. And these are planted with different crops such as rice, corn, banana, cassava, and other crops. And the good thing is we can still see the patches of primary undisturbed forest in the upland. Next. Okay, so we have, we can see the drone photographs showing the legal occupants with the area cultivated and planted with corn, together with the established access road. Okay. This is located near the Tulap, which is one of the headwaters of the watershed. Next. Okay, this one is the timber poaching or the small-scale logging. We observed this in one of the headwaters of the watershed. The next. We also observed the occurrence of grass fire, particularly in grassland areas and in shrubland areas, which are also, of course, threatens the wildlife. Next. Then these are the landslide occurrence along the creeks, which also affects the water quality produced by the watershed. The previously mentioned threats will possibly drive the habitat loss of wildlife, particularly those threatened species of flora and fauna in the watershed. Next. This is a very common problem in lowland areas along the river banks and even in several farmlands near the rivers and creeks. So aside from the farmlands, the infrastructures were also damaged. No? And we can see the need for the immediate rehabilitation of the riparian areas. Okay, next. The water contamination. Improper waste disposal, grazing, and farming in the uplands all affects the quality of water produced by the watershed. As we can see in the photographs, there is a carabao in the river. Okay, so it contaminates the water. Next. So the profile, the ecological profile of the watershed, as the output on the assessment was presented to various stakeholders prior to the formulation of the plan for the validation of the data gathered. And of course, for the inputs of the stakeholders, particularly the national government agencies such as the DNR and the National Irrigation Administration. Okay. Next. Based on the profile, we identified several possible solutions to the identified issues and challenges within the watershed. So the draft plan was also presented first to the barangay level, especially the stakeholders from the upland areas for their inputs, particularly in the interventions, and then followed by the consultation and discussions with the local government units and other national government agencies. Next. The interventions is through the integrated watershed management approach, taking into account the social, economic, and environmental issues of the watershed. We identified 6 main strategies. So first, we have the sustainable water resource development and management. One of the activities is the bamboo plantation along the river banks of the watershed. Then next, we have the conservation and protection of biodiversity and unique scenic landscapes. Some of the activities in this strategy is the delineation of the local conservation area, as well as the establishment of permanent monitoring plots for the biodiversity. Then next, we have the rehabilitation and restoration of degraded ecological systems and habitats. One of the major activity in this strategy is the conduct of assisted natural regeneration within the degraded secondary forest of the watershed. Then next, we have the ecotourism development. One of the main activity in this strategy is the formulation of ecotourism management plan. Then, of course, for the provision of sustainable livelihoods, we identified the activities on the community-based enterprises. And then lastly, for the establishment of multi-sectoral, multi-level, and interagency watershed management structure for the Balasig Watershed, which is part of the governance aspect or component of the project. This is all about, of course, the management council of the watershed. Okay, next. So this is the proposed management structure of the Balasig Watershed. We have here the council, no? The executive committee, composed of different coordinators from the local government units and from the MGAs and other organizations and institutions. Then 4 units will be also established to be led by supervisors from the Isabela State University with necessary technical capabilities. And they will be, of course, headed by the program manager, who will be the full-time staff of the watershed. And then all the projects will be led by project leaders. Next, for the details of the council, okay, the chair would be from the municipality of Cabagan, co-chair from municipality of Tumawini, then the vice chair is the DNR through Senro Cabagan, and then the members, we have the different agencies and institutions. For the funding and institutionalization of the structure, okay, the plan was already presented to the Sangguniang Bayan of Tumawini and Cabagan for the adoption and annual appropriation of the interventions identified, and as well as the inclusion or the integration of the interventions during the updating of their local development plans. the Isabela State University will also adopt the watershed as priority area for research, development, and extension activities. Then, of course, MOA will also be crafted and to be signed between and among the members of the council with the different stakeholders. We have this DNR, DA, okay, DTI, what else? Okay, and of course, other partners from the local, national, and international institutions. Okay, so that's all, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rocel. So again, thank you for the sharing regarding the details of the Balasig Watershed project, including some realities and challenges on watershed management. Indeed, addressing the socioeconomic aspect of watershed management is a great challenge. But given the involvement or participation of the mandated agencies, the local government, academe, communities, and other stakeholders, guided by the management plan, I am certain that the Balasig watershed shall be managed more effectively. So thank you for those information and sharing. So at this time, may we allow some questions raised by our participants to be responded by our resource person. So from, we got here a question from Paulo Pagaduan. What studies were conducted to support the plans to plant bamboo along the riverbanks? What are the objectives of planting bamboo there? So may we request Forester Rocel to share more about the effort on bamboo planting along the riverbanks. Sir Rocel?
Hello, sir. Yes, sir. Actually, there were no research conducted in this particular intervention. We included the planting of bamboo along the riverbanks because we, based on the review of the different plants, we observed that they already proposed several bamboo projects in the area. Okay, so the main purpose of the planting of bamboo is for the protection of the riverbanks, particularly the riparian areas along the creeks and rivers of the Balasig Watershed.
Thank you for that clarification. And we are also aware during the partners meeting for Sierra Madre that bamboo plantation is one of the program of the government as shared by the resource person from the Department of Trade and Industry. Another question, is there a legal, from Mr. Ramil Sanchez, is there a legal basis mandating local chief executives for the management of watersheds in their area of responsibilities? So again, maybe Forester Rocel, can you cite some basis for engaging the local chief executives? Do they have a local ordinance or a national law mandating these local chief executives for watershed management?
Hello, sir. Yes, sir. Actually, the plan was already presented in the local government units, particularly Cabagan and Tumawini, and they both agreed on the plan to have this council. But as to the legal basis, sir, I think I cannot answer it yet.
But is there a plan to adopt the watershed adoption by means of an municipal ordinance so that there will be a legal basis for managing the watershed?
Yes, sir, but that is actually the plan of the team. So the first step was to present it in the Sangguniang bayan of the two municipalities. Then later for the approval of the local chief executive.
Sir Dante, do you have some more to add on the aspect of the legal basis for mandating local government to manage their respective watersheds?
I think the local government code by itself mandates any LGU to manage its own jurisdiction. That means that everything within their geographical jurisdiction is under their responsibility, and the local government is mandate by itself, I think.
Yes, sir. We were aware that per the local government code, the respective LGUs have the mandate to manage their watersheds. Of course, in partnership and collaboration with the mandated agency, which is the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So follow up to bamboo planting. They say that planted bamboos along riverbanks may potentially hinder the flow. The river overflows into the riparian area, which may lead to backlog or flooding of areas upstream. In simple words, it may create a temporary damming of the watershed once the bamboo fell into the river channel. So that may not serve the purpose of planting bamboo for watershed management, but it may hasten some temporary flooding along the way. So do you have some actual experiences or some scientific discussion on the use of bamboo, Sir Dante?
None particularly, but there's a mandate to maintain vegetation along riverways. So bamboo by itself is an immediate approach towards establishing vegetation along waterways, along rivers. There should be vegetation to prevent stream bank erosion. And in that way, it's not, to me, a negative aspect when it comes to introducing bamboo along the riparian parts of the watershed.
Maybe the use of bamboo will be one of the area for research by the Isabela State University in implementing the Balasig Watershed management plan to really test the appropriateness, the effectiveness of using bamboo for riparian rehabilitation. In terms of there's a query on the socioeconomic impact. But since the project has just started, the Balasig Watershed project has just started, they just formulated the watershed management plan, and there's still yet to implement the watershed management plan. I think there's still no socioeconomic impact on the interventions. That will be part of the monitoring and evaluation aspect of the watershed management plan. So the management plan should be the basis of any intervention, either using native trees, bamboo, or any appropriate vegetation for rehabilitation, not just the riparian areas, but also on the degraded areas within the watershed. That should be reflected and that should be based on science and clearly indicated in the respective watershed management plan. We should not be planting by convenience or participating in the bandwagon as one commented, but should be based on science, based on the developed management plan for that area. Comment from Sir Dominic Rodriguez that most of the riparian area of the Balasig River used to be surrounded by buho, the native bamboo in that area, but they were already cleared due to kaingin. And as our experience in Sierra Madre, the presence of buho are indicator of areas annually affected by forest fires. So sometimes these buho plantations exist due to presence of forest fire. So I have seen no more concern for other queries. Maybe we can later collate these unanswered comments and will respond to you accordingly. But for the interest of time, I'm afraid we're not going to accommodate more questions anymore. So at this time, may we thank Dr. Dante Aquino and Rocel Galicia for sharing their thoughts on watershed management, the interplay of forest, water, and people. And watershed management is indeed a challenging task. There is a need to consider the science of watershed management. And we learned the interplay